There is a saying that arson investigators use. The bug is always in the crowd. It means the person who set the fire is almost always standing there watching it burn, watching the smoke column rise black and heavy into the evening sky, watching the firefighters scramble across the lot, pulling hose, watching the families press against the police tape with their hands over their mouths, not quite believing what they are looking at. Arsonists come back to what they have made. They cannot help it. Fire does something to them that nothing else in their lives can replicate. Not recognition, not money, not any of the ordinary things that drive ordinary people. For a certain kind of mind, there is nothing in the world like standing close to a fire you have created and watching it do exactly what you designed it to do. They come back. They stand in the crowd. And to anyone who does not know what they are looking at, they look just like everyone else. John Leonard Orr knew that saying better than anyone in California. He taught it to younger investigators. He worked it into his conference lectures. He used it as a cornerstone of his professional philosophy. This idea that the arsonist reveals himself through compulsion, that the need to witness is finally the thing that gets them caught. Over the course of a long and publicly celebrated career, Orr used that understanding to help investigators catch dozens of arsonists who had hidden themselves well. Colleagues called him gifted, near psychic in his ability to read a fire scene. He walked into burned buildings and knew things about them that other investigators, working the same evidence, simply could not arrive at. He looked at ash patterns and char marks and told you exactly what had happened, exactly where it had started, exactly what kind of device had been used, and by what kind of mind. He knew all of this because that mind was his. John Orr set nearly 2,000 fires across Southern California over the course of 30 years. He set them in stores while families were browsing the aisles. He set them in suburban neighborhoods while people slept. He built his devices with a specificity that spoke to deep technical knowledge. A lit cigarette, 3 wooden matches, a folded square of yellow ruled notepaper, held together with a rubber band. He placed them inside merchandise displays, in among pillow stock and fabric rolls and polyurethane foam products, and he walked out the door and drove away. Already calculating. Already listening to the radio frequency his department used. Already thinking about the call that would come and how long the drive would be and what angle he would want to approach from. 4 people died in the fire he set on the evening of October 10th, 1984. One of them was 2 years old. This is the story of John Leonard Orr, the fire captain, the arson investigator, the novelist, the most prolific serial arsonist in the documented history of the United States. And the man who, for 30 years, stood in the crowd at the edges of his own fires while every badge and every credential and every respectful nod from every colleague in the state told the people around him to look somewhere else. Before we go any further, if you are new here, this channel exists to tell the stories that history almost buried. Stories about the people who hid in plain sight, the ones nobody suspected, the ones the system trusted completely, handed a badge and a title, and pointed at a crime scene, never imagining they were pointing at the wrong person entirely. If that kind of story matters to you, hit subscribe right now. It costs you nothing, and it means these stories keep getting told. Now, let us get into it. John Leonard Orr was born in Los Angeles on April 26, 1949. He grew up in the city during the post-war expansion when Los Angeles was becoming something enormous, sprawling outward in every direction, eating up desert and orchard and farmland, and replacing it with freeways and shopping plazas and identical suburban streets. It was a city that rewarded a certain kind of ambition. The kind of ambition that knew how institutions worked and understood that a badge meant something, that a uniform meant something. That to be the person other people deferred to in a crisis was to hold a kind of power that no amount of money could exactly replicate. Orr wanted that power. After a stint in the Air Force in the late 1960s, he returned to Los Angeles with a specific plan. He applied to the Los Angeles Police Department. He failed the psychological exam. He applied to the Los Angeles Fire Department. They found him physically unfit for duty. 2 rejections, 2 institutions that assessed him and concluded he was not what they needed. For a man who, as prosecutors would later argue, was driven fundamentally by a need to be recognized, respected, and quietly superior to the people around him. Those rejections mattered in ways nobody could have measured at the time. He pivoted, enrolled in fire science courses at night, took day jobs, studied on his own time with a discipline that suggested he had not given up on the goal, only recalculated the route. In 1974, he secured a position at the Glendale Fire Department, then the lowest-paying department in the Los Angeles area. And he started at the bottom. He did not plan to stay there long. Orr turned out to be genuinely exceptional at the investigative side of firework. His instinct was noticed immediately and talked about within the department in the particular way that unusual talent gets talked about, quietly, between people who are not quite sure whether to be impressed or slightly unsettled. He could enter a fire scene and reconstruct what had happened with a speed and precision that seemed, to anyone watching, almost intuitive. He read burn patterns the way a musician reads a score, quickly, holistically, his brain processing the geometry of destruction into a narrative before most people had finished looking around. He rose steadily, made captain, became one of Glendale's primary arson investigators, and eventually its most publicly visible one. He gave presentations at regional fire investigation conferences. He was quoted in newspaper articles as an authority on arson crime. He claimed to have caught more than 40 serial arsonists over the span of his career, a number he offered with the easy confidence of a man who had lost count, because the number was so high that exact figures seemed beside the point. He was the man you called when a fire scene made no sense. He knew what the scene was saying, because he had written it. When Orr's fires began to cluster into a recognizable pattern is a question that was still being investigated years after his conviction. Some evidence points to activity as far back as the late 1970s. What becomes clearly documented begins in 1984, when a series of deliberately set fires appeared across Southern California, in fabric stores, craft supply shops, home goods warehouses, always during business hours, always using the same method, always achieving the same result. A fast, aggressive fire that overwhelmed the merchandise and its immediate surroundings before the sprinkler systems overhead could mount a meaningful response. The device was elegant in its simplicity. A cigarette, burning at its natural rate of about 7 minutes per inch down toward a cluster of wooden matches. When the flame reached the matches, they ignited. The paper caught. The rubber band caught. The surrounding merchandise caught. By the time a customer smelled smoke, the device itself was ash. There was nothing to recover. There was nothing to link to a maker. Orr chose his targets with the knowledge of someone who had spent years understanding fire chemistry and fire behavior. Polyurethane foam, synthetic fabrics, polyester pillow fills, materials that burn fast and release dense toxic smoke, smoke that incapacitates before the fire itself reaches a person, which means the danger from a fire in a store stocked with these materials is not what most people imagine it to be. It is not the heat that arrives first. It is the air becoming unbreathable, which means you may not know you are in serious danger until the moment you are already in it. John Orr understood all of this before he walked into a store. Through 1984, the fires were damaging but largely contained. Property losses, injuries, the kind of incidents that appear in departmental records as serious but manageable. And then came the evening of October 10th, 1984. Ohl's Home Center was a large hardware and home goods store anchored in a shopping center in South Pasadena. The kind of store where you drove on a weeknight to pick up whatever the weekend project needed: paint, fixtures, lumber, something for the garden. On that evening, it was busy the way such stores are always busy on weekday evenings, steadily, unremarkably, with no reason for anyone inside to feel anything other than the mild, purposeful calm of a routine errand. John Orr had been in that store earlier. He had moved through it without drawing attention, which was not difficult. He was a middle-aged man in civilian clothes doing what middle-aged men do in hardware stores. He had found his location near a display of polyurethane products in the rear of the building. He had placed his device in among the merchandise. He had walked out. Among the people in the store that evening was a 50-year-old woman named Ada Deal. She had brought her 2-year-old grandson, Matthew Troidel, along on what should have been a brief errand. Working that shift were Carolyn Krause, 26 years old, the mother of 2 young children, and Jimmy Satina, 17 years old, a high school student on one of his first jobs. The device activated. The polyurethane products exploded into fire. What happened next happened in seconds. In fire science, a flashover, the event in which every combustible surface in an enclosed space reaches ignition temperature simultaneously and the entire room becomes fire at once, is the most catastrophic transition point in any structure fire. It is survivable in one circumstance only: if you are already moving toward an exit at the moment it occurs. If you are not, the window closes in the time it takes to register what is happening. Ada Deal did not make it out. Her grandson Matthew did not make it out. Carolyn Krause did not make it out. Jimmy Satina did not make it out. Fire investigators converged on the scene within the hour. They were professional and systematic in their examination of the collapsed structure, the burn patterns, the structural damage to the roof. The conclusion, reached by nearly every investigator present after thorough review of the physical evidence, was accidental, electrical fault. The kind of thing that happens in large retail buildings with complex wiring systems running at high capacity. Tragic, but explainable. Nearly every investigator. John Orr arrived while the building was still in its last stages of collapse. He stood at the edge of the scene, not in turnout gear. He had not brought it, or had not offered it. Carrying a 35mm camera, he photographed the fire from multiple angles. He documented the collapse. When investigators began sharing their preliminary findings, he dissented, not quietly, with the confidence of a man who is certain he is correct. He told them the fire was arson. He described what a deliberately set fire in that particular location, using those particular materials, would look like in its aftermath. And he told them that what they were standing in was exactly consistent with that description. Every word he said was accurate. He drove home that night knowing exactly what he had made. The fires continued. Through 1985 and 1986 and into 1987, Southern California experienced an ongoing series of retail fires that investigators struggled to connect to each other because the jurisdictions were spread across the region, and formal information sharing between departments in that era was slower and less systematic than it would later become. But within the specialist community of arson investigators, awareness was building. There was a pattern. Someone out there was doing this deliberately, repeatedly, with sophistication. A task force began forming around that awareness. And then came the detail that changed everything. Fire investigators from different departments began comparing notes on when and where the fires were occurring. The pattern that emerged was anomalous enough to be genuinely troubling. The fires were clustering around arson investigation conferences, regional training seminars, professional gatherings where investigators from across the state would come together for several days to share methodology and update their knowledge. Fires before, fires during, fires in the days after. In 1987, fires broke out in Fresno during a regional conference. In 1989, another cluster appeared near a conference in the Bakersfield area. In Pacific Grove, along the California coast, the pattern repeated. A fire captain from Bakersfield named Marvin Casey had been paying attention to this for long enough that he sat down with attendance records and began comparing them systematically. He was looking for a name. A single name that placed one person at every conference in every city where the fires had broken out immediately before, during, or after the professional gathering. He found John Orr's name. But Marvin Casey also knew what he was looking at. Orr was a fire captain, a respected senior investigator, someone with colleagues and connections and a professional reputation that spanned the California fire community. An accusation of that weight, leveled at that kind of person, required more than a pattern on an attendance sheet. It required physical evidence. And at the time Casey was doing his cross-referencing, the physical evidence was maddeningly incomplete, except for one piece. At one of the conference-linked fires, a task force member had recovered something from the scene that had partially survived the blaze. A piece of yellow, ruled notebook paper, the kind used to construct the incendiary devices. And on that paper, preserved well enough to be examined, was a fingerprint. Partial. Not complete enough, with the fingerprint analysis technology of the mid-1980s, to produce a definitive identification. The print was photographed, entered into evidence, and filed, and there it sat. For years. While it sat in that evidence file, John Orr drove to conferences, led presentations on arson investigation technique, accepted handshakes and professional courtesies from the investigators who were quietly trying to build a case against someone who fit his exact profile. He was in those rooms. He participated in those discussions. At one point during these years, the task force, now formally established and nicknamed the Pillow Pyro Task Force after the arsonists' targeting of polyurethane bedding, circulated a flyer describing the suspected serial arsonists' methods and characteristics to investigators across the region. Orr received that flyer. He read a description of himself. He filed it. And in the summer of 1990, John Orr set the largest fire of his career. The College Hills neighborhood sits in the foothills above Glendale. It is the kind of neighborhood that photographs well from a distance. Densely wooded, the houses tucked between mature trees and sloped gardens, the kind of place where families put down real roots and meant to stay. On June 27, 1990, a fire began in the hillside brush and moved into the residential streets with a speed that overwhelmed the initial response. By the time the fire was brought under control, 67 homes had been destroyed. Hundreds of people had been displaced from houses they had lived in for decades. The financial loss ran into the tens of millions of dollars. It was the worst residential fire Glendale had experienced in memory, and John Orr was one of the first investigators on scene. He was also, by this point, the fire captain of the Glendale Fire Department. He had been promoted. He had more authority and more access and more professional respect than at any point in his career. Colleagues noted something that day that they would discuss later during the investigation, with the particular discomfort of people whose perception of events has been retroactively reordered. They noted that Orr's behavior at the College Hills fire seemed peculiar, that he was there very quickly, that he seemed to know things about the fire's origin and progression that, given when he arrived, he should not yet have known. Nobody said anything. He was the captain. He had a sixth sense for these things. Everyone knew that. That same year, Orr was formally appointed fire captain of the Glendale Fire Department. And in the evenings and on weekends, John Orr was working on his novel. He had been building it for years. The title was Points of origin. A fire investigation term that refers to the precise physical location where a fire begins, the most critical piece of evidence in any arson case. The story followed an arson investigator named Aaron Stiles. Aaron was charming and intelligent. He was professionally respected. He set fires in retail stores across California using devices made from cigarettes and matches and paper. He targeted buildings stocked with highly flammable merchandise during business hours. He was, the novel made explicit, sexually aroused by fire. By the act of setting it, by the act of watching it, by the particular power of being the only person in the room who knew what had really happened. Aaron also attended his own crime scenes. He offered his expert analysis to the investigators working around him. He was, in the world of the novel, never suspected. Orr sent the manuscript to literary agencies with a cover letter. In that cover letter, he described points of origin this way. He wrote that it was, and these words are documented in evidence, introduced at trial, and verifiable, a fact-based work that follows the pattern of an actual arsonist who has been setting serial fires in California over the past 8 years. He has not been identified or apprehended and probably will not be in the near future. He was talking about himself, in a letter, with his name on it, to strangers. He mailed it. In late 1990, a task force investigator retrieved the old fingerprint from the Fresno evidence file and submitted it for reanalysis. The technology had advanced significantly in the years since the print had been collected. The new analysis was definitive. The print belonged to the left ring finger of one person, John Leonard Orr. The task force that assembled around that match understood the delicacy of what they were doing. Moving too quickly, tipping Orr off in any way, would give him the opportunity to destroy evidence, disappear, or simply become aware enough of the investigation to ensure that nothing further could be connected to him. They needed to build the case from the outside in. So, they watched him, followed his vehicle, documented his movements across the region. They positioned themselves to observe when he traveled and where he went afterward. In the fall of 1991, investigators watched Orr set a fire in Fresno. They observed it. They documented it. They had what they needed. On December 4, 1991, John Leonard Orr was arrested. When investigators searched his home and his vehicle, they found the manuscript for points of origin. They read it with the specific attention of people looking for something they already suspect is there. In the novel, Aaron Stiles sets a fire at a hardware store he calls Cal's Home Center. The fire spreads through the building's inventory with terrible speed. It traps 2 employees and 2 civilians, a woman and her young grandson. Orr wrote the scene in detail. He described the fire's progression, the structural collapse, the moment the woman and the child understood what was happening around them. The last thing she heard, he wrote, was a tremendous roar as the fire burned through the roof and vented to the outside. The Olds Home Center, South Pasadena. October 10, 1984. A roar, a roof, a woman, and a child. John Orr was asked about the similarities. He said Aaron Stiles was a composite character assembled from real arsonists he had arrested over the years. He said the novel was fiction. He said the parallel was coincidence. The jury took 8 hours. In July of 1992, John Leonard Orr was convicted on 3 federal counts of arson stemming from the Fresno fires and sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. The investigation continued. The Olds fire, the 4 people who died. 2 years of additional work by prosecutors and investigators building the murder case from the physical evidence, the witness accounts, and the forensic reconstruction of the 1984 scene in light of everything that was now known about how Orr built his devices and chose his locations. In 1994, Orr was formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each person who had not left Oll's home center alive, and 20 additional counts of arson spanning fires across Southern California. The trial began in 1998. Orr's daughter, Lori, took the stand for the defense. She loved her father. She believed him innocent with the kind of certainty that can only come from love and proximity, from knowing a person, as someone real and present and familiar, rather than as a name in an investigation file. She testified to that belief plainly and with obvious sincerity. Her testimony moved people in the courtroom. It was not enough to acquit him, but it was enough, in the estimation of the jury, to spare him. They recommended against the death penalty. John Orr was convicted on all 4 murder counts, convicted on all 20 additional arson charges, sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. After his conviction, investigators opened the archival record. They re-examined fires that had been classified as closed. They requested files from jurisdictions across the region that had never been cross-referenced against Orr's movements and known methods. What came back from that process was a picture that senior investigators found difficult to fully absorb. Federal ATF agent Mike Matassa, who spent years working the case from within the investigation, concluded that John Orr had likely set approximately 2,000 fires in the period from 1984 to 1991 alone. The full scope of his arson activity, stretching back into the 1970s and accounting for fires in jurisdictions that were never formally reviewed, may have produced a number considerably larger than that. After Orr's arrest, the number of brush fires in the foothill communities surrounding Glendale dropped by more than 90%. 90%. Take that number apart slowly, because what it actually says matters. It says that for years, not months, years, a significant proportion of all fires in that region had one origin, one person, who then drove to the scene in his official vehicle, parked near the perimeter, and walked forward to offer his expertise to the investigators working around him. He examined crime scenes he had created. He collected evidence from devices he had built. He told other investigators what they were looking at and how to read it. And some of them wrote his words into their official reports and closed their cases on the basis of his analysis. Lori Orr eventually came to believe her father was guilty. She had maintained his innocence for years after his conviction, defended him, testified for him under oath, held his innocence as a kind of fixed point against which all the evidence was measured and found, in her accounting, insufficient. And then something shifted. She worked through the evidence on her own terms, in her own time, and arrived somewhere she had not expected to be. She cut off all contact with him. She later co-wrote a book about the experience of arriving at that conclusion. She called it Burned. In interviews about the book, she described what it cost her to finally see clearly, the version of her father she had held on to, and what it meant to let it go. John Orr is in his mid-70s today. He is incarcerated at Mule Creek State Prison in California. He writes for the prison newspaper. He corresponds occasionally with journalists who reach out to him, and in February of 2025, more than 30 years after his arrest, he spoke by phone with the Los Angeles Times. He told the reporter that the character of Aaron Stiles, the arson investigator in his novel Who Sets Fires, attends crime scenes, and is never suspected, was assembled from composite details of real arsonists he had caught during his career. He said the novel was fiction. He said he is innocent. The question of what drove him is one that psychologists and investigators have attempted to answer in different ways, and none of the answers are entirely satisfying. His defense attorneys argued at trial that he suffered from obsessive-compulsive personality disorder and a clinical form of pyromania, that he was, in a medical sense, compelled, that the drives operating in him were beyond ordinary control. prosecutors argued something colder, that Orr was motivated by the desire for a specific and uncommon kind of power, the power of the person who knows what no one else knows, the power of being the expert, of being trusted, deferred to, brought forward into the center of the room while the people around you have no idea that the room itself is your creation. His daughter, in interviews after she came to believe he was guilty, described his relationship to fire as something that had a sexual dimension to it, that watching something burn was, for him, an experience that no ordinary language quite covers. What is documented is this: he chose fires in crowded stores. He did not set his fires in empty buildings at night. He set them when customers were present. He set them when employees were at their stations. He set them in conditions that maximized the chance that a real emergency would unfold, that real firefighters would respond, that real investigators would be called, and that he would have a genuine reason to be there. The fire had to be real. The danger had to be real. The response had to be real. Only then was the experience, apparently, what he needed it to be. That is not the psychology of a man who made mistakes. It is the psychology of a man who made choices. He has said these things for more than 30 years, and he says them now with the same consistency. The fingerprint says something different. The 90% drop says something different. The 4 people who did not leave Oll's home center on the evening of October 10th, 1984, cannot say anything at all. Their names, Ada Deal, Matthew Troidel, Carolyn Krause, Jimmy Satina, appear in the court record and in the investigation files and in the book about the case. They appear here. After the sentencing, Orr's wife divorced him. His daughters eventually cut off contact. The community that had known him as a professional, as a colleague, as a trusted authority, quietly absorbed what had happened and moved on in the way communities do, by not looking at it directly for longer than necessary. The television appearances and the newspaper articles and the conference presentations were not erased exactly, but they were no longer referred to. The record of what he had done existed in the court documents and the evidence files, and people who wanted to understand it could go and look. The case was documented in a book by the celebrated crime writer Joseph Wambaugh, published in 2002, which examined the investigation in detail. It remains one of the most thorough accounts of how the case was built and what it meant to the investigators who worked it. Orr's own novel, Points of Origin, was published after his conviction. It remains in print. The people who read it now read it knowing what they are holding. Not fiction written by a creative professional exploring the darker corners of human psychology, but a document written by someone describing, with the specificity of personal experience, exactly what he had done and why he had done it, and how it felt. He described, in a novel he tried to sell to the public, the experience of setting fires. He described the power of it. He described the pleasure of standing at a crime scene he had made. He described the satisfaction of the particular position he occupied, the only person in the room who knew the truth, surrounded by people who trusted him completely. He called it fiction, but there is one more thing, and it is the thing that does not fully close. The fires attributed to John Orr with legal certainty number in the hundreds. The fires believed to be his, on the basis of device signature, targeting pattern, and geographic proximity to his documented movements, approached 2000. Many of those cases were never formally reopened. Some jurisdictions submitted no records for re-examination. Some fires were ruled accidental years ago and sit in storage somewhere in a closed file with nothing in them connecting the event to a man named John Orr, which means there are families out there who lost someone and were told it was an accident. Families who received an explanation that felt like a closing of something. Families who never heard the name of the man who built the device and placed it and walked out and drove away and eventually showed up with a badge and a camera. Some of those families are still out there, still carrying something they were given and told was the truth. He stood in the crowd for 30 years, and some of what he made may never be fully accounted for. These stories exist because someone decided they were worth telling, and they keep existing because people like you decide they are worth sharing. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the institutions we build and the people we place inside them and how much we simply choose to trust, share it with one person today. Subscribe if you have not already. Leave a comment below telling me what you think was really driving John Orr. Was it the power? The secret? The particular satisfaction of being the smartest person in a room that has no idea who it is talking to? I read every single one. I will see you in the next one.